Hi, welcome all to this series of webinars about Israel-Palestine and the question of apartheid. These webinars are organized by docP-BDS Netherlands, Palestine Link and the Rights Forum. It consists of a series of 3 webinars. The current webinar will be about apartheid and international law. And the next webinars will be held the coming 2 Thursdays, Thursday 4th of June and Thursday 11th of June on the same time. The topics of the webinars, of the coming webinars, will be mechanism of apartheid, apartheid in practice in Israel, the diaspora and the OPT. And the one on the 11th of June will be about anti-apartheid mobilization and a global struggle against racism and discrimination. This webinar will be about apartheid and international law in general. In the full series of webinars, we will discuss the relevance of the concept of apartheid in the analysis of the human rights situation in Palestine. So, to what extent can the term apartheid be applied to Israel's treatment of the Palestinians? How does apartheid manifest itself in Israel and in the occupied territories on legal, policy, and practice levels? What can past and present struggles against racism elsewhere teach us about activism against Israeli apartheid? And finally, in the last one, how can solidarity activists all over the world be most effective in supporting the Palestinian struggle against apartheid? So recent developments, such as Israel's adoption of the nation-state law in 2018 and the current US-backed plans to annex large parts of the West Bank, underline the urgency of discussing the apartheid topic and how to deal with it. This webinar will last maximum till 8:30 Central European Time. During the session of tonight about apartheid and international law, we will have 2 speakers, Professor John Duggart and Professor Virginia Tilley. They will do their presentations first. During the presentations, the audience can ask their questions. You can ask your questions through the question option in the box. The questions will be collected and they will be brought together by my co-moderator, Ghada Zaidan. After the presentation of Professor Tilley, the questions will be answered by the speakers, by both speakers. So please, when you ask your questions, be very short, and please specify to which speaker you want to ask the questions. This webinar will be recorded and can be viewed afterwards on the sites of docP-BDS Netherlands, Palestine Link, and the Rights Forum. The first presentation will be by Professor Dugard. John Duggart is Emeritus Professor of International Law at Leiden University and at the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa. He was previously the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Palestinian territories occupied by Israel since 1967. Long title. As an expert in international law, Professor Dugard has gained experience with apartheid in South Africa, Namibia, and Palestine, and he wrote his book Confronting Apartheid in South Africa and Palestine. This book is about opposition to apartheid within the law and through the law. John Dugard describes the work he undertook in defense of human rights in these areas. So in Southwest Africa, Namibia, South Africa, and more recently than in Palestine. So the question is there hope that Israel will ever be sentenced for its violations of Palestinian human rights, including the crime of apartheid? And other issues related to this topic will be discussed by Professor Dugard. So please, Professor Dugard, the floor is yours, or the screen is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, Gerard. Tonight, I'm going to be speaking about the crime of apartheid in relation to Palestine. Let me begin by saying that there is a close connection between apartheid and colonialism. This has been well documented by Virginia Tilley in a book she edited some time ago called Beyond Occupation, in which she and the authors emphasized that apartheid and colonialism are really closely related. Let me begin by saying something about apartheid in South Africa. Before 1948, law and practice in South Africa was very similar to the law and practice in relation to race relations that existed in colonies and, of course, in the deep south of the United States with its Jim Crow laws. So race discrimination was widely practiced, but there was no clear legislative order to enforce segregation and discrimination. In 1948, just at the time that the decolonization process started in the United Nations, the National Party came to power in South Africa on the platform of apartheid. And this meant that the government was now determined to convert what had previously been discriminatory practices into law, and to ensure that this new law was vigorously enforced. Of course, this involved legislation in many fields. Legislation was adopted in respect of discrimination in relation to freedom of movement in particular, and the use of amenities. For instance, segregation was introduced, apartheid was introduced in respect of parks, schools, university, beaches, and so on. Then there was residential segregation. Blacks and whites were compelled to live separately. The whites obviously got the better suburbs. And then there was territorial separation, which later became known as the Bantustan policy, which provided for the establishment of so-called independent states for the different African tribal groups. What is important is that both residential segregation and territorial.
You're there.
I'm sorry about interruption. As I was saying, that the new apartheid order was based on race discrimination in all fields of life in South Africa. Inevitably, there was mass resistance to apartheid and widespread protests. And this, of course, resulted in further oppression from the apartheid regime. And so this led to very strict security laws, which provided for detention without trial, implicitly provided for torture and disappearances, detention without trial, arbitrary arrest, and assassinations, and also led to attacks on neighboring states. It's important to stress the two prongs of apartheid in South Africa were discrimination and repression. So what was the international response? Well, first of all, there were many resolutions in the General Assembly condemning apartheid. But in 1973, the General Assembly gave its approval to the Convention on the Suppression and Punishment of the Crime of Apartheid. This was a very important convention, which first of all declared that apartheid was a crime against humanity. One must bear in mind that the crime against humanity is very serious. It's almost on a level with the crime of genocide. And the convention stressed that this was not a crime that was confined to South Africa. The convention defined the crime of apartheid as inhuman acts committed for the purpose of establishing domination by one racial group over another racial group and systematically oppressing it. The inhuman acts that are listed in the convention were murder, torture, assassination, arbitrary arrest, territorial separation, persecution, and it also included laws that were designed to enforce segregation in social and economic spheres. But it's important to stress that there was no international court to enforce this convention. In 1980, an attempt was made to establish such a court, but that failed. So it was left to national courts to prosecute the crime of apartheid. National courts were given the power to prosecute persons for committing the crime of apartheid. But in fact, no national court ever prosecuted a person for the crime of apartheid. So the convention has now been in existence for some 47 years, and there has never been a prosecution. There have been no prosecutions for the crime of apartheid in South Africa itself. Even the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which spoke about the apartheid being a crime against humanity, did not find that anyone had committed the crime of apartheid. Today, there are about 109 states that are party to the Apartheid Convention. Palestine became a state party in 2014, but South Africa is still not a party to the Apartheid Convention, which is very strange. No Western European state other than former Soviet bloc European states is a party to the convention. Then in 1998 came the Rome Statute, which established the International Criminal Court. And this provided that one of the species of crime against humanity would be apartheid. So we now find apartheid given new force in the
apologies, it seems we're losing John. So I suggest that we're continuing now with Professor Tilley, Virginia Tilley, in order to, and then we come back later to John, because and we will try to fix the problem with John Duggart's connection. So we would like to continue now with Professor Tilley. Virginia Tilley is Professor of Political Science at South Illinois University. She's, among others, the author of The One-State Solution, co-author of Beyond Occupation, Apartheid, Colonialism, and International Law in Occupied Palestinian Territories. And she is also, together with Professor Richard Falk, co-author of a report entitled Israeli Practices Towards the Palestinian People and the Question of Apartheid. At the end of 2017, uproar arose when ESQA, the Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia, a UN commission, released this report. The report sparked furious reactions from the Israeli side, and Israel exerted such pressure that the ESQA report was taken from the UN website, but it's still alive. It's still there, but not on the UN website anymore. The responsible UN employee, Ms. Rima Khalaf, resigned in protest. And but I think it would be good if you could tell us a little bit more about about your vision on apartheid in Israel and Palestine, and on the ESQA report and all the others.
All right. Yes. Thank you. Is that all right? Can you hear me all right?
We can hear you.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Good. All right. Thank you. I was glued to John's presentation, and I'm so sorry he had those technical difficulties right in the middle of sentences that I very much wanted to hear. So I count on his coming back with this. I plan to speak following his presentation, but now I'll say the same thing, but hope that it will lead into his presentation, and maybe he can even address some of these at some point in our session. Whether Israel is practicing apartheid in the OPT in the occupied territories is a vital question that I hope the ICC will address in its deliberations, although I wasn't clear from what John was saying whether that's the case. If we go by definitions of apartheid in international law, the case for finding this does appear overwhelming. Among other places, it was established in that exhaustive South African legal study later published as Beyond Occupation, which John mentioned. That was just an academic finding by a team of lawyers, though, and not a finding by an authoritative body such as the ICC. So that step would be terribly important. Yet confining the question of apartheid to the OPT, in my view, creates serious contradictions that we do have to acknowledge. On the one hand, it would confirm that Israel's occupation is illegal, which has not been firmly established in any other way. This would follow a close precedent, apartheid South Africa's occupation of the neighboring country of Namibia. Back in the 1970s, the International Court of Justice found that South Africa's rule there was illegal, partly because South Africa was imposing an illegal racist regime of apartheid on Namibia's people. The same principles should therefore hold for Israel's occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. It would be hard to argue that differently, I think. But on the other hand, restricting the question of apartheid to the occupied territories can falsely suggest that the crime of apartheid would be ended by Israel's withdrawal from the OPT. And that would not be the case any more than apartheid ended when apartheid South Africa withdrew from Namibia. For even in the unimaginable scenario where Israel abandons hundreds of billions of dollars of settlement infrastructure and withdraws from the West Bank, which is not imaginable and must be considered a pipe dream, I think, the crime of apartheid would then continue unabated inside Israel, where it continues to hold inside Israel, just as it continued inside South Africa, where it held millions of Black South Africans under a racist regime. This problem helps us recognize an obvious fact, that Israel practices apartheid in the OPT because it is in design, Israel is in design and practice a regime designed to ensure Jewish national domination of all territory under its control. Israel tailors its governance in the various parts of this domain to ensure that one overriding goal. And this is what has to be confronted. It was a second legal study for the UN Economic and Social Commission of West Asia, or ESCWA, which found that Israel practices apartheid as a comprehensive regime on Palestinians wherever they live, including inside Israel's internationally recognized borders, the ones established by the 1948 war, which are often called Inside 48, Israeli policies inside the OPT, and in Jerusalem, which has a separate system, and regarding refugees. Israeli policies in all of these areas must be read in light of the imperative of Israel remaining a Jewish state, because those policies are synchronized toward that end. They're interdependent. They were designed to work together. This is a big 70-page study. I hope it's fairly readable, so I can't go into it here, but I'll just highlight a couple of things. For example, consider Israel's dual legal system in the OPT, which accords civil law to Jewish settlers and all the privileges and rights that go with that, such as due process of law, proper court procedures, and representation, and so forth, but military law to Palestinians in the same territory, just down the road, right? This dual system has often been criticized as a form of apartheid. Yet it cannot even be understood without reference to the civil law inside Israel, which ensures Jewish ethnic domination both inside 48 and in the OPT. This discrimination experienced by Palestinian citizens of Israel has been thoroughly examined in excellent studies over the decades. that have described how it works. Adala, the Legal Center for Arab Minority Rights in Israel, in Haifa, has identified over 50 Israeli laws that favor Jewish citizens either directly or in effect by design. The ESCA report references some of these if you're interested. What matters for us here is the greater purpose of these laws, to ensure Jewish national domination within Israel over all non-Jews, including Israel's non-Jewish citizens. Sometimes this purpose is achieved by assigning special rights to Israeli citizens who qualify for citizenship under the law of return. That's the phrasing. This is code for Jews, as the law of return applies only to Jews. Sometimes it's achieved by putting whole public sectors, such as the development of towns and cities, under the direct or indirect authority of the so-called Jewish national institutions, the Jewish Agency, the Jewish National Fund, and the World Zionist Organization, which are charged by law to manage Israel's resources solely for the benefit of the Jewish, not Israeli, nation. This is how 93% of Israel's land is within Israel, famously restricted to use by the Jewish people in the sense of a nation. And here I want to pause to highlight something that in debates about this often gets confused. In Israeli discourse, the term Jewish shifts in meaning depending on the legal challenge the system is confronting. When Israel is challenged as racist for being a Jewish state, its advocates insist that Jewishness is an ethnic identity and that Israel has the right to sustain its Jewish character, quote unquote, on grounds that states represent ethnic identities all over the world. When Israel is then challenged for internally racist laws, such as its prohibition on mixed marriages, Jewish is affirmed to be merely a religious identity. It's the religious authorities that control marriages, absolving the state of this policy. When discrimination is challenged on the basis of colonialism, a settler society versus an indigenous Palestinian Arab society, Jewishness is reaffirmed as a dissent group in the sense established by Israel's Declaration of Independence, the true Jews being the true indigenous people unjustly expelled in antiquity that is only returning to its lost kingdoms. Yet in today's world, human rights law doesn't accept any of these arguments. Ethnic domination in states or the state's identification with one ethnic nation at the expense of others is absolutely prohibited. National identities cannot be defined by biological descent, national meaning a nation associated with state, because this would obviously create impossible problems in territorial nation states where citizenries are inevitably composed of people with quite different histories. Whole volumes of human rights law prevent these kinds of discrimination. So we must be continually alert to these discursive sleights of hand, the shifting ground of Jewish is deployed about, and look at the whole picture. And here we come to the fundamental framing condition that Israel as a state, a modern territorial nation state on the international stage, is self-defined in its basic law as a Jewish and democratic state. This formula creates a dilemma common to any ethnic or racial democracy, that it must sustain a safely large ethnic majority in order to preserve ethnic domination of the democratic system. The same problem confronted other racial democracies such as South Africa or White Australia before it dropped it, and each of these states had to come up with its own solution for it. Israel's first step was to simply expel the original Arab majority in 1948 mainly, leaving only a small minority of Muslim and Christian Arabs within Israel's territory. The same imperative then translated into Israel's immigration laws, which actively encourage Jewish immigration to Israel, yet prohibit the return of Palestinian refugees to their own homes and lands. And the same imperative informs Israel's rule in the occupied territories, where a combination of Israeli civil law and military law provides the same Jewish ethnic advantages and domination to Jewish settlements and settlers relative to the non-Jews, the Muslims and Christians living just down the road. That Israel's regime comprises one seamless system throughout Mandate Palestine is especially clear when we consider how Israel's land laws and civil law extend into the OPT. Israeli settlers enjoy Israeli civil law, as I mentioned earlier. Yet civil law itself is tied to laws that preserve state land for Jewish national interests. Inside Israel, this and other laws have created the sweeping racial segregation we see in Israeli cities, towns, and roads, and agricultural land, and everything else. These same laws operate in the OPT, exactly the same laws imported into the OPT to build Israeli settlements, industrial zones, and agriculture as Jewish-only developments, with additional special arrangements such as the role of settler movement authorities like the Yesha Council. Why do Palestinian citizens of Israel not also live in these planned, subsidized settlement communities? Because they're set up through Israeli domestic laws and institutions that prevent this, drawn from Israeli civil law. I'm going to jump over a couple of things here that expand on that a bit and go to another feature of the system, which is the right to vote. Unlike Black South Africans, Palestinian citizens of Israel do have the right to vote, something that's often cited by Israel's advocates to argue that Israel can't be held guilty of practicing apartheid. But again, in South Africa, Blacks were the great majority. Whites couldn't allow them to vote because through that power, they would immediately eradicate apartheid laws securing white domination. In Israel, Palestinians are now about a 20% minority. Harsh restrictions on anyone becoming an Israeli citizen can therefore ensure that Palestinian citizens remain a safely small minority whose votes can never alter the so-called Jewish character of the state. In some, non-Jews in Israel have the vote because it doesn't matter that they have it. It's ineffectual. But ethnic domination can also survive, as South Africa found, only as long as there is little or no racial mixing. No mixed marriages, for example, that would make discrimination unworkable. In the West Bank, Israel therefore keeps Jewish settlers and the Palestinian population strictly apart. And it does the same thing inside Israel in only slightly softer ways. I won't go into that much except to say that there's been several studies of this, how Jewish towns can prevent Arabs from living within them on grounds of social compatibility. A recent Human Rights Watch report about zoning that is really suffocating Palestinian towns with stringent zoning limitations and so forth. On one level, of course, this kind of ethnic program is hardly surprising. Israel's stated purpose, its very reason for being, is reflecting the mission of the Zionist movement since the 19th century, is to provide a state for the Jewish people in a national sense. The Palestinians, therefore, have always comprised a demographic threat. Israel's term, not anyone else's. It's hard to imagine anyone in the US and Europe saying something like that. But the occupation then serves Israel by giving Israel complete control with all of Mandate Palestine and allows Israel to ensure that Palestinians who live in the OPT cannot move into Israel or intermarry with Israeli citizens and erode the system of Jewish governance, Jewish national governance. Even ethnic mixing at modest levels would quickly demolish the social consensus to run Israel as a Jewish state privileging Jews, therefore has to be prevented. There's much more to say on this, but I just want to close by saying how this informs our understanding of any viable peace agreement. In short, Jewish statehood cannot coexist with a Palestinian state in the OPT that would have the full sovereignty associated with the state. Among other problems, to be viable, such a state would have to have open borders, and Israel cannot permit this because it would bring social mixing, which would again threaten Israel's Jewish character. As Sharon, Rabin, Peres, and Netanyahu have all stated one time or another, what Israel imagines is therefore that Palestinians have something less than a state. That's the phrasing. In other words, a Bantustan. The term Bantustan is, of course, taken from apartheid South Africa, which faced the same problem. The white regime's solution to its Black African demographic threat was to transfer Black citizens of South Africa into fragmented enclaves nested inside territory of South Africa to provide supposed self-determination to Black South African language groups, the Zulu, Tswana, Venda, and so forth, which the white regime redefined as separate peoples, each with the right to self-determination. In this sense, whites were another people with the right to self-determination. And so everybody would get their right fulfilled in this fragmentation of the territory. The ANC, which people unfamiliar with the case might associate with Nelson Mandela, rejected this completely. And the whole world eventually saw through it, recognizing that the right to self-determination was being perverted in this case to justify a racist partition of the land to the great advantage of the white population. Yet in Mandate Palestine, exactly the same strategy, partition of the land on racial nationalist grounds, is being supported by those pushing partition. Why? On what legal basis is this racial partition defended? Attempts to cite obsolete measures such as the failed UNGA Resolution 181 or the British Peel Commission in the 1930s fall apart upon the slightest scrutiny. In fact, when you think about it, the only reason to partition Palestine into two states is to provide that apartheid continue unabated in one of them, a Jewish ethno-national state sitting next to a non-ethnic Palestinian state. That is illegal. International law requires that where apartheid is being practiced, it must end. Ending apartheid cannot be achieved by simply moving the borders in which it operates. This is why the whole premise of Jewish statehood must come onto the table, difficult as that is to face. Israel has no right to exist as an apartheid regime, and the legal obligation to end the crime of apartheid would not be fulfilled by other states and international actors by allowing an apartheid regime to continue operating inside Israel. Territorial divisions, the green line, here obscure rather than clarify what is really going on, which is one comprehensive apartheid regime operating in all of Mandate Palestine, which was intended to be one country as formed by the League of Nations and has never been successfully partitioned and should not be partitioned, certainly not on the basis of ethnic nationalism that violates international law. But I look forward very much to John's taking on these questions and maybe proving me wrong. So I'll close on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Virginia.
Thank you, Virginia.
Now, it looks like we have John back. John, can you hear us?
Unmuted.
Can you hear me now, Gerard?
Yes, yes, we can hear you. So happy to have you back, John. So you can continue your part.
Yes, I won't be long. Virginia has demonstrated very convincingly that apartheid does apply in the occupied Palestinian territory. We do have two racial groups. We have the settler group with some 700,000 settlers that dominates the Palestinian population. We have serious inhuman acts that have been committed: murder, assassinations, house demolitions, forcible population removals, and these acts have clearly been committed with the intention of imposing racial domination by one group upon the other group. The dominant group is the settler community, backed by the Israeli Defense Forces. So it's quite clear that one can make out a strong case for the commission of an international crime of apartheid having been committed in the occupied Palestinian territory. My difficulty is that I like to see international crimes as enforceable crimes. So I'm particularly concerned about crimes that can be enforced by, or can be heard by a court of law and can be enforced. And the difficulty is that the International Criminal Court simply does not have jurisdiction over crimes committed by Israel within Israel itself. It only has jurisdiction over crimes committed in the Palestinian territory, and it only has jurisdiction over crimes that reach a certain degree of severity, a certain gravity here. And that is why it becomes very difficult to talk about the commission of the crime of apartheid in Israel itself. It's important to stress that at present this matter is before the International Criminal Court. The prosecutor has asked the pre-trial chamber of the court to examine the question of whether it has jurisdiction or not. And in her request of December 2019, the prosecutor indicated that she had made certain tentative conclusions relating to the commission of crimes within Palestine. And as far as crimes committed by Israel were concerned, the only crimes that she seemed to contemplate are war crimes, which indicates that it's extremely difficult to persuade the prosecutor of the ICC that crimes against humanity have been committed, including the crime of apartheid. So it's an uphill task, but it is one that must be pursued, and Palestine insists that the crime of apartheid has been committed in the occupied Palestinian territory. It's also important to look at the politics of the International Criminal Court, and it's very clear that the principal funders of the International Criminal Court, Western European states, Japan, Australia, and Canada, are opposed to the very idea that the court will exercise jurisdiction over Palestine, even in respect of the construction of settlements, which is clearly a criminal offense. And so one has to deal with this very obstructive international political agenda, which is determined to protect Israel at all costs. And that's why I believe that it's important to look at the crime of apartheid in a situation in which it may be heard and determined by a court of law, in this case, the International Criminal Court. And it's only crimes committed in the territory of Palestine, the occupied Palestinian territory, that fall within the jurisdiction of the court. So I think it's very interesting to examine the question of whether the crime of apartheid is committed in the territory of Israel itself or in the diaspora. But the sad truth is that the International Criminal Court does not have competence to consider this matter. And I think personally, I prefer to concentrate on what can be achieved. And at present, the best one can hope for is that the International Criminal Court will prosecute this crime. And that really explains the differences between Virginia and me. But now let us turn to questions.
Thanks, Virginia and John, for your presentations. Yeah, let's see what questions we got. Rada, could you come in?
Yes. Well, I have 6 questions so far. And let me start with some of them some of the people who ask questions tell exactly who they want the question to be answered by from the speakers, and others pose general questions to both speakers. So I will start with the questions one by one, and we'll see how they are going to be answered. The one question says, most countries just use worn out rhetoric in supporting Palestinians behind the curtains. They work with Israel. Is there any honest broker?
Who is that question directed at?
No, there is no. So both of you, basically.
I think both of you would be good.
The position has already been adopted that the United States was the honest broker, and for many years the Palestinians have looked to the United States as honest broker, but I'm sure that Virginia will agree with me completely when I say that the United States is today a dishonest broker, and no help is to be claimed from the United States. So that leaves, I suppose, the European Union as the only possible candidate for the role of honest broker.
Yes.
Virginia?
We don't hear you.
Yeah, sure. Well, of course, I agree warmly with John's assessment of the dishonest broker. I mean, it's just been a fiasco and a farce, I think, for many years on that one. But we have another, I mean, I don't think the EU is a place to run to. I mean, the EU has demonstrated a real spinelessness on this. Really impressive spinelessness that I don't see that shifting inside Europe anytime soon. I think John made a good point about the political climate, but I'm a little bit surprised that he left it there, because John, of all people, knows how the South African case evolved, right? I mean, there was a not unfavorable political climate for confronting apartheid in South Africa for a long time. It took decades. The movement really, there were certain laws that were passed that kind of changed the system a bit in the 70s, and once that happened, and the movement really got going. It wasn't really until the mid-80s that the whole world began to stand up and have anti-apartheid demonstrations, you know, in solidarity, and it rapidly grew into a international boycott in the space of about 10 years, to the point that the political environment was completely different. We might remember there that the United States was among the very, very last countries to agree that it was a criminal regime. It was the U.S. stuck it out longer than almost any. So those who were expecting the U.S. to change and lead on something like Palestine are I think, living in fantasy land. But it also, that history tells us we don't have to wait for the United States or Europe. This is one of the reasons why I think it would be very helpful in the United Nations system to revive the Special Committee on Apartheid. There used to be a Special Committee on Apartheid during the anti-apartheid years for South Africa. It was dismantled after the fall of the regime. But we now have a very serious question on the table about whether this is another case of this crime. And the special committee could be charged with examining that. And through that process, consensus can be built that would change the environment, just as happened in South Africa. I'm also curious with John about I had a question for him in the back of my mind, and maybe he can answer it or we can address it later. That the signatories to the Apartheid Convention have a legal obligation to act to end apartheid. If they can't do that through the ICC because of the ICC's jurisdiction restrictions, there has to be, they can't just stop there and throw their hands in the air and say, well, we can't do anything because of the ICC. They still have that legal obligation, and I'm wondering how John would foresee them pursuing that, and by what route, aside from, as I said, I think that the political environment does need to change. I agree with him completely on that. But how else he's got such erudition in the world of international law, maybe he could help us understand how what other routes there might be for these states to fulfill their legal obligations, because presently they are failing those legal obligations, at
Yes.
least as according to the growing professional consensus.
Yes, the 1973 convention does provide that national courts should exercise jurisdiction over the crime of apartheid, wherever it was committed. So in theory, it would be possible for an Israeli general who visited, shall we say, South Africa, to be charged and tried in South Africa. Well, South Africa is not a party to the convention, but it is a party to the Rome Statute, which contains the same obligation. But it's asking really too much of any state to confront not only Israel, but the European Union and the United States by prosecuting an Israeli for the crime of apartheid. And that's the political difficulty that we faced, because for 47 years, states have failed to comply with their obligations, either by enforcing or by prosecuting people, Israeli criminals, in their courts, or by taking other action. And it's appalling that the 109 states that are party to the Apartheid Convention have not used their influence more within the United Nations itself. Obviously, there's much that they can do, but you talk about the European Union being spineless, but other states in Africa and Asia are equally spineless, and unfortunately, one cannot expect China or Russia to take the initiative in this respect either.
Yes. There's a question to Professor Dugard. Could you please comment on the ICC-PTC's recent order to the State of Palestine to provide additional information on the cessation of agreements with Israel and the US? Can this be viewed as stalling or ever obstruction of the process? Is this the end to justice and accountability at the ICC for Palestine?
No, it's a very strange request that has been posed by the pre-trial chamber, and one doesn't quite know what information they require. The government of Palestine will obviously provide an answer to the question posed, and then one hopes that the pre-trial chamber will render its decision possibly before the summer recess. It can be seen as a stalling device, but if one is optimistic, one must still hope that the pre-trial chamber is determined to find the right solution to this situation.
Yes. There's a question: are Palestinians abandoned by the world, including the Muslim countries? What interests the civilized, between brackets, world has in letting Israel virtually do whatever they want? Israel would never let a proper Palestinian state come into being, and would also not accept a one-state solution. What is the ultimate solution? Who will implement and how? The international law, that's a question. It's a question for both of you.
Virginia, you go first.
Oh, I was going just going to say you go first. Well, I think the language of the question, I appreciate the question. I understand it completely, and it of course kind of wraps up the big picture in a kind of depressing way. But I just noticed the language of the question, that Israel will not accept X, right? Israel will not accept a one-state solution. In the South African case, there was widely believed that white South Africans would not accept democracy, right? I mean, there was the real dilemma. Black South Africans were insisting on their full rights, and whites were absolutely insisting on not giving it to them. And that was considered to be this head-banging problem that was really, I remember myself in 1986 saying, I didn't see how they were going to solve this, because there you have two, irresistible force and an immovable object, right? But it just crumbled. Okay, I mean, when the money began to crumble, now Israel's a long way from that stage, but in South Africa, there was problems with the boycott financially. There was the problem of the sports boycott, which was demoralizing. There was the country itself was becoming ungovernable. This was particularly important. The domestic movement was getting stronger and stronger. And it just became unmanageable. They began to lose control, and they started talks with Nelson Mandela on a very mushy level, like, we will give blacks a few more rights and freedoms in order to calm the country down. And Nelson Mandela looked back at them and said, no way, it's good, it's over. Apartheid has to go, whole cloth. And it took a few more years of struggle, sometimes very tense struggle, and I think John was very central to those years. Remembering armored vehicles bashing through the glass front doors of the building where the talks were taking place, and so forth. Before that was before the regime gave it up, right? They realized that they could not keep it up. Now, so why are we just simply sitting there and saying, well, the settlers won't allow X? There are 6 million Palestinians plus, 6+ million Palestinians inside Mandate Palestine under Israeli direct rule, one way or another. That's half the population. It's entirely within the scope of Palestinian population to make that country ungovernable, using peaceful demonstrations and civil disobedience methods that they used in South Africa and other countries. There is a growing international consensus that Israel is practicing racial discrimination, if not apartheid, and increasingly more and more people are using the A word there and saying this actually is apartheid. So they're starting to lose on the international stage as well. So, and they know that, which is why they're getting much more aggressive about the solidarity movement, going after BDS people and the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, and trying to run after anyone who uses the apartheid word to stifle that and say that it's anti-Semitic and so forth, because they're getting really nervous because they know that the credibility of Jewish statehood is in fact rather fragile, and that it's vulnerable to that. So I see these more as kind of flowing, evolving political conditions in which the role of certain actors such as the EU and Arab states, and Arab states, heavens, the entire project of partition and a Palestinian state has completely lost credibility. Why shouldn't the Gulf states partner up with Israel on money and power and arms sales, to get rich and enjoy themselves when this failed project is just sitting there crumbling into dust? I think when the Palestinian movement translates an entire self-determination statehood thing, when it's recognized as a Bantustan, when it's abandoned for that reason, and it becomes a democracy movement, that the Palestinians will immediately inherit the entire South African story, and they will inherit similar struggles all over the world against racial discrimination. The terms of the struggle will transform completely, which is what some Israelis have said as well. Ehud Olmert said that once the Palestinians adopt this as an anti-apartheid struggle, Israel is over, right? A Jewish statehood would end. He said that from the bully pulpit more than once. And I think that might be a simplistic way to think about it, but I think he's right. And I think the Israelis are very nervous about this because they are the whole legitimacy of Jewish statehood stands on ideas that this represents a principled human rights mission for the Jewish people in compensation for the dreadful things that happened to them over the last few centuries, and especially the 20th century. But if it turns into a racist regime that's oppressing an indigenous people in unacceptable ways, consistent with what happened in South Africa in many ways, but certainly consistent with international law prohibiting this, then we're changing the entire terms of the debate. And I think then we'll find more African states coming in on this. They're already thinking about it. We'll find more side actors starting to pile in. And once that starts to shift in the General Assembly, as happened with South Africa, then the kind of chemistry, the political chemistry of this, I think will change. I think it's a much more viable, workable campaign. Anti-apartheid, equality of everyone in dignity and rights, that's the basic pillar of the entire human rights world system. And that would be what they would be going for instead of the self-determination line. So I'm sorry I went on a bit long there, but I think, and I'm sure John has a good retort to it.
No, I can be very brief. I agree with everything you said, Virginia. You will be surprised to hear. I think one thing you failed to mention is the absence of leadership. Living in South Africa during the late 80s and 90s, I was convinced that there would be a civil war with bloodshed. And then, fortunately, a leadership emerged in South Africa, both in the ANC and in the National Party. It wasn't only the leadership in the ANC, the National Party, that led to the downfall of apartheid. It was leadership amongst Western nations and other states. And what is really distressing about the world today is that no one is prepared to really stick her or his neck out for Palestine and to call a spade and to say Israel is practicing apartheid in Palestine. Why does the Secretary General of the United Nations, for instance, not take lead? We know, because he's beholden to the United States. It's appalling that a number of prominent Western states have objected to the exercise of jurisdiction by the ICC, Germany and Canada in particular. And one thinks of the leaders of Germany and Canada as being prominent human rights persons. And so this is really disappointing. I think that without leadership amongst nations and leadership on the part of both Palestinians and Israelis, one is not going to see an easy solution to the problem.
Yes. We still have time, Gerard, for some more questions? We still have time for some more questions?
Yes, we have.
Yes. Okay, there's another question to both speakers, which is linked to this one, actually. Would adopting the frameworks of apartheid impose a reality of the one-state solution? If so, how can the Palestinians then realize self-determination in the context of a system that was originally built and has expanded on the basis of elimination of the Palestinians?
I wonder which system that is referring to, the Israeli system or some other system? Or?
Also, there's another part to the question, maybe I should read that as well, but also from a technical legal perspective, would the apartheid framework applied to Palestine undermine accountability for grave breaches of international humanitarian law which amount to crime? How can we ensure the preservation of international humanitarian law in that context?
Okay, well, maybe I could take the first one and John could take the second one, because I think the observation that the self-determination of the Palestinian people comes onto the table with this apartheid framework is very smart. I mean, that is really the elephant in the room, isn't it? Because over the last few decades, the Palestinian people has been redefined as the not Jewish. Okay, and there's a kind of a normative shift in that. The early formulations of Palestinian nationalism were territorial. Everyone in the territory was Palestinian. Jews, Christians, Muslims, everybody. Druze, Circassians, everybody. Over time, from the Zionist movement coming in, what Palestinian became Palestinian Arab, for one thing, to distinguish those people from the mostly European settlers that were roaring in to set Palestine. But what that did was it redefined what the Palestinian people means now, because Jewish Palestinians were absorbed mostly into the Zionist movement, right? And that's a bit of a historical point, but what I want to say is that today, South Africa confronted the same problem when it talked about colonialism of a special type, right? Settler colonialism raises different problems from classic colonialism. With classic colonialism, you hope that the white Europeans will get on ships and sail away, okay? In a settler society, that's not going to happen. These people have already cut their ties to Europe. They're not going anywhere. They are going to stay there. Some will leave, as in South Africa, many whites got on planes and left, okay, when democracy was achieved. But the Palestinian nationalism does now have to accommodate the fact that there are millions of Jewish settlers in this land who have completely indigenized. They have a language, they have a national culture. All of that has to be part of something called Palestine in Mandate Palestine, right? And the ideology of accepting that means having to look at some really difficult questions like the Arabness of being Palestinian. Right? You know, to be Palestinian in the sense of citizenship can't be Arab when half the population isn't Arab, right? So I have no simple solution to this, but it's obviously an important question that has to be brought forward. But what I would say is that the way that idea of self-determination has been used now, which is now a cherished pillar of a lot of activism, is identical to the language of the white South African apartheid regime in affirming that Black people were going to express their rights to self-determination as separate peoples, which the white regime told them they were, and that their self-determination would be expressed in these enclave states. That is kind of what's going on now, except that the PLO accepted it. The ANC rejected it. In South Africa, the ANC absolutely rejected that idea and said, no, 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 no. There's one people, there's one nation here, the South African nation, and it's divided racially, illegally, and wrongly, and wrongfully. In the Palestine context, somehow that has become the norm, that the Palestinians are some subgroup of the society, and that they are going to have their self-determination in this little patch of land within Mandate Palestine. Actually, in saying that Palestinian nationalism needs to be reconfigured, I'm actually not saying anything new. Those gray-haired among us remember very well that until the Oslo Accords, that was the dominant discourse. The dominant discourse was that you could be Jewish and Palestinian and it didn't matter, right? That Palestinians had the right to self-determination in all of Mandate Palestine, and that it could be multi-ethnic and multi-religious and so forth. It was the Oslo Accords, which never prescribed two states, by the way, but gave everyone the idea of this, that kind of reified the idea that this is the norm. This is the facts on the ground. There are two peoples in one land, and those two peoples each have the right to self-determination. But I think if we take the apartheid analysis to the point of using the Bantustan lens to look at that again, we find it's got a very sordid side, and it has resulted in what we see now, a Palestinian Authority which is corrupt and incapable and failing. Right, and failing to govern, failing to achieve its goals, failing its people to protect and help and develop its society, and everybody knows that, and it's becoming a kind of a elephant in the room. Again, I've gone on a bit long about this, but I'm glad the question was asked, because I've thought about this quite a bit. As a non-Palestinian, non-Jewish person, I can only observe this as a kind of a political problem that other peoples have faced as well, and I think the Palestinians are now confronted with that. But it will have to be an internal process of debate and rediscovery about what Palestinian is supposed to mean in a one-state solution.
Yes, I will be very brief. I don't think one can divorce the question of Palestinian self-determination from the question of Palestinian statehood, because at present the argument that Palestine is already an independent state presupposes that the Palestinian people have the right to exercise their right of self-determination within the state of Palestine. Of course, if you look at the broader picture, whether there should be a one state which encompasses both Jews and Palestinians, then you have to look at the demography of the situation. And Virginia has rightly pointed out that at present there are probably more Palestinian Arabs in the land between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River than there are Jews. And if Israel goes ahead with its plan to annex large parts of the West Bank and ultimately to assert its authority over Palestine, one is going to find a situation in which the Jewish community is in the minority. And this seems so obvious that it doesn't have to be stated. But the strange thing is that the Jewish Israeli electorate doesn't see this obvious truth.
Yeah. There is a question to Professor Tilley. What is the difference between Israel as a nation state and new nation states in Europe, like Finland, Austria, Poland, Estonia, Hungary?
What is the difference? Okay. Well, I think the questioner is probably thinking about the ethnic character of some of these states in terms of language groups, in terms of some kind of sense of cohesion and cultural affinity. And so what's wrong with that happening in Israel? Well, the difference is, well, aside from the colonial history, the settler society rolling in on top of an indigenous people in quite recent decades and depriving them of their rights in the same land. I mean, we did 19th century, sure, you know, that was happening everywhere, but it's not something the 20th century was so willing to accept. But the real difference is that those states do not distinguish among their citizens on the basis of ethnic national identities. They don't, within Sweden, for example, you don't find a Swedish nation that's distinct from the Swedish citizenry. And in Israel, legally, juridically, all right, according to the Supreme Court's decisions and everything else, and not least the nation state law that Israel just conveniently passed and so made it a lot easier for people to see, Israel has there is no Israeli nation in Israeli law. Nobody, it doesn't exist. There's legally, there's no nation of Israel in Israeli law. There's only a Jewish nation. And that means that the state is supposed to provide for the Jewish nation and not for its entire citizenship. The state is not representing all of the people. In law, it is not representing all of the people. It's only representing one nation, that's the Jewish nation, and the Jewish nation has ascendancy and superior rights to everybody else. You find that nowhere. Okay, there is not one state in the planet that does that. Israel is unique in that. Since apartheid fell in South Africa, but it was done in South Africa the same way. There was they tried it and it failed to create a white nation, which was really driven by Dutch Afrikaner, the Dutch Settler Society, which is called Afrikaners, and they wanted to they understood themselves as a people with, you know, the right to self-determination, and they were confronted by all these black people who inconveniently were there. They came up with some of the same lines about it. They weren't really there before. The land was empty. The blacks were drawn to white business and jobs and same stories, but they were facing an overwhelming black majority, and they had to create a legal system ultimately called Grand Apartheid, where the self-determination would be allotted to themselves and made sense of by giving it also to these other people. in these little fictive states. That fell. That was discredited. It was seen as racist. It's gone. It generated a lot of law and global activism. And now Israel stands as the only state that I know of on the planet that does the same thing. It distinguishes among parts of its population as not belonging to the state. The state represents only an ethnic nation called the Jewish nation. That's a very, very different model, and it violates all kinds of human rights laws.
Yes, there's a question to Professor Dugard. A participant says, Professor Juan Sorota from the University of the Basque Country wrote an interesting article on the wall of shame that Morocco has built in the occupied territory of Western Sahara, comparing it with the apartheid wall built by Israel in the occupied Palestinian territories of, occupied territory of the Palestinian West Bank. In the light of the Israeli wall advisory opinion, could you also say something about this comparison?
Well, there is a real comparison between Western Sahara and Palestine, and frequently reference is made to the relevance of the advisory opinion on the war to Western Sahara. And I would simply say that it is important to make that comparison, and one must bear in mind that Western Sahara is today neglected too much. Too little attention is paid to the question of Morocco's occupation of Western Sahara.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think we have to close now. Thanks a lot for to the speakers for all these these insightful presentations. I think we really got a lot of information and good information about what apartheid means, also about the similarities with the situation in South Africa. We also touched on well the links between the justice, the political will, and the needs for civil society to do something. I think in general we see that there's agreement that there is apartheid in at least in the occupied territories, and about what is the situation in Israel and how to deal with it. Especially there is some well, different opinions on it, or at least some different views about how to continue with it. But I think what we already did during this session is we touched already on some of the topics that will be discussed in the following webinars about the mechanisms of apartheid, how it shows itself in Israel and Palestine. Also compared to other contexts, and also what can be done against it. I think also, especially Virginia mentioned it quite sometimes. So this will be dealt with in the coming webinars on 4th of June and 11th of June. Same time, same time, same channel. Yeah, I would like to thank the speakers for their very good presentations, and everyone who had been attending. Thanks for attending us, and we hope to see you next time during the next webinars. Thank you.